Alright guys, so libertarian comedian Dave Smith recently made an appearance over on Piers Morgan where he got into a pretty heated exchange with this Zionist over here on a number of different things, including the recent IDF operation in Gaza where they went in, they ended up retrieving 4 Israelis who were taken on October 7th, and in the process of doing so, ended up killing over 270 Palestinians as well as wounding countless hundreds of others. So let's just go ahead and jump into this and try to work our way through it and see if maybe Piers Morgan is still on this new arc that it seems like he's been on recently, where he's being a little bit more critical of Israel's actions. So let's go ahead and jump into this.
A lot of people are part of the problem, it seems to me. The longer this war has gone on, the more entrenched people have got into their various tribes, and it's got increasingly toxic. There's no admission by anyone in those tribes of any wrongdoing on their side. And there's no attempt to come across the bridge and forge any kind of settlement, resolution, or peace. It seems to me like we are entering a really depressing phase of all this war. What is your view?
Okay, I'm sorry. He's going to respond to this, but I just got to say, that question is a little bit ridiculous, right? Because it's not as if we have two equal sides of this conversation. We're talking about a genocide. Okay, genocide is wrong. War crimes are wrong. By the way, regardless of whether or not it's Israel, or it's Hamas, or it's the United States, or anybody else committing war crimes. If you're going around and wantonly killing civilians, that's wrong. Point blank, period. You should be prosecuted. You should be held accountable for it. But to pretend as if, like, oh, it's just two toxic sides that are battling it out, it's like, no, there's one side that's protesting war crimes and genocide and starvation and ethnic cleansing, and then the other side is justifying those things. So these are not exactly two equal sides of this conversation that need to come together on this, right? There are productive ways to have conversations, but this shouldn't be a controversial issue here.
Well, I can't disagree with any of that. It's certainly depressing. I mean, listen, this has been going on since October. We're 9 months into this thing now, so it's been depressing for a while. And I agree with everything you said in your opening, that of course, perpetrating violence against innocent civilians is wrong, no matter who does it. And that ought to be the basis for Western civilization. I mean, especially for people who like to kind of brag about Western civilization and the aspects where it's superior to others. The thing here, though, right, is that, as you say, Israel doesn't just have a blank check signed in Palestinian blood, but objectively, the reality seems to be that they do, and that they have unconditional support from the United States of America, the global superpower, no matter what. Even if our own president asks them not to do something and they do it, they still continue to receive this unconditional support. And of course, but as I've said to you before, Pierce, and I think this has kind of been the fundamental truth throughout this entire conflict, is that the only way you can really support Israel and what they're doing is if on some fundamental level you value Israeli life more than you value Palestinian life.
Okay,
and if that's your starting point, fine. But if that's not your starting point, then you don't look at a mission that got 4 Israelis back and killed a bunch of children as a success.
Well, you see, that's where I have a real, again, I've used this phrase many times in this war, a moral quandary, and I'll tell you why.
Okay, Piers. I mean, really? We're still doing this game? Oh, it's all so complicated, it's morally ambiguous. No, it's not. No, it's not. They went in a mission to retrieve 4 Israelis who were being held in Gaza, and in the process of doing that, caused close to 1,000 Palestinian casualties. They bombed a market in the middle of the day. They killed dozens of children. This is not a moral quandary. None of this is a moral quandary, especially not because of the fact that Israel, for months at this point, has been rejecting a ceasefire proposal that Hamas has been in favor of a long time ago at this point, that could result in every single one of the Israeli hostages being returned from Israel. That's something that I don't see a lot of people who are justifying the recent hostage rescue mission, or whatever you want to call it. They don't bring up the fact that there's another way you could get these hostages back. It's not as if going and doing a military raid is the only possible option on the table. You could do a ceasefire. Israel does not want a ceasefire. They want to continue with this genocide.
Should there be any limit, given that Hamas kidnapped these people, kidnapped young women, they kidnapped babies, they kidnapped Holocaust survivors, as well as murdering and wounding thousands and thousands of people? Should there be any limit to what Israel should be able to do militarily to rescue those hostages? From all the footage coming out, they planned this because they had information about where they were being held. They then sent special forces in to get them, came under heavy, heavy fire, And as a result of that, there were air cover sent in as well. And I'm just curious, what should be the limit on Israel to go and rescue these innocent kidnapped hostages?
Is that a real question? Should there be any limits? What are we saying here? So if Israel goes in and they kill the entire population of Gaza to get the hostages back, is that okay? What? Of course there's an upper limit. I mean, you could have a conversation about what is that limit, but to ask the question, is there a limit? Of course there is. You can't just go and wantonly kill a bunch of civilians, which, by the way, kind of contradicts the entire logic behind, saying that Hamas is the most evil, brutal, Nazi, ISIS terrorist organization on the face of the planet, right? The logic behind the Israeli criticism of Hamas is that they're evil and they're brutal and they're savages. Why? Because they killed innocent civilians in Israel. So to say that about Hamas, but then to turn around and justify killing hundreds, and throughout the entirety of this, thousands, tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians to go after Hamas, it's like you're doing exactly what you say Hamas did, killing innocent civilians, at a much larger scale. But somehow it's okay when you do it, or it's even good when you do it. But when Hamas does it at a smaller scale, then somehow that's evil, brutal, barbaric terrorism, right? You see the contradiction here? We're going to go after the bad guys who are bad guys because they kill civilians, and we're going to do that by killing a bunch of civilians. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, look, the limit should be, in general, what the limit over this conflict should be is that if your number one priority is to get back the hostages, I think this whole campaign would have been conducted in a very different way than it has been over the last 9 months. But, look, what's wrong, the essence of what makes it immoral to take these hostages is that these are innocent people who did not do anything to forfeit their natural God-given rights. But that also has to apply to innocent Palestinians who were not involved in October 7th or have no blood on their hands. We're not members of Hamas militant groups. And these are, and we're describing millions of people who fall into that category. And so, in an ideal world, the limit would be that you could only go after those people who were directly responsible. Now, in war, that's rarely the case, that there are no innocent casualties. However, I think a reasonable approach would be to expect Israel to do what they always claim that they're doing, which is just a blatant lie, which is that we're doing everything we can to avoid civilian casualties.
Okay.
But very clearly, that's not been how they've been conducting this war.
All right, Emily.
I mean, he's 100% correct. And by the way, Piers' timeline on how he broke down what happened wasn't even true. Okay, they didn't go in there as a part of like a targeted operation and then they came under fire and they returned fire against the people who were shooting at them and then some civilians got caught in the crossfire. That's not how this played out. Before they actually went in to the locations where these Israelis were being held, they bombed the shit out of Gaza, the surrounding area, in an effort to try to create a distraction from the rescue operation that they were conducting. So the bombing began well before they actually went in to retrieve the hostages. Then they were fired upon and then responded by what? I mean, just carpet bombing innocent civilians willy-nilly? I mean, they basically went in just completely guns blazing. We don't care what's in our way. We're going to get these 4 people out and kill as many people as we want in the process of doing that. Now, we're going to skip ahead here to a later part of this debate where, again, Dave is going to get into it with this Zionist over here. So let's go ahead and skip ahead to that portion of this conversation.
How do we rebuild trust and get to some sort of peace? I mean, you must have thought about this a lot, Dave, like we all have. What do you think?
Well, I mean, look, it certainly seems like a daunting task, and it seems right now that we're about as far from peace as we could possibly be. I think I may have said this to you when we were doing your show when you were in New York a couple months back. But, last year I went and did comedy shows in London, and then I flew over to Ireland and did shows right there. And, you guys are right next door to each other. And there was a time when it seemed like you guys could never achieve peace. The truth is that as many pro-Israelis like to brag about, at Camp David in the late 70s, Israel did make a land deal with Egypt, a land for peace deal, and that peace stuck. They went to war 4 times in a little over 20 years, and they haven't been to war ever since. And so as bad as things do seem right now, I do believe that there's a path where there could be a deal made and there could be a lasting peace. But the bottom line is that what you have to understand, and I appreciate Emily saying that, like, there's been a lot of atrocities on both sides. I don't think anybody would deny that. And I don't think anyone would deny that Hamas has some responsibility for atrocities that they've committed. But the point is, the underlying fact that you can't get away from here is that this is an asymmetrical conflict. Israel has occupied Palestine since 1967. We're not talking about a few months after a war or even a few years after a war. We're talking about longer than the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe. And the idea that people say, well, if Hamas just surrendered today, the war would be over. Like, let's even say that's true, which I'm not convinced it is, but let's say that's true. And then what?
It's definitely not true, by the way. Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly said that even if there was a dream hostage deal that could be facilitated to return all of the hostages back to Gaza or back to Israel, that the war would not end. Okay, so he continues.
What? Live in subjugation forever? I mean, look, the height of the Netanyahu doctrine was 2 weeks before October 7th, when he went to the United Nations with a map of greater Israel, including Gaza and the West Bank all being Israel. That was the peak of the Netanyahu doctrine. And what he was telling the world and the Palestinians was, it's over, you lost, we won, we made our deals with the outside Arab world, no one's coming to save you. You live in subjugation forever. And the culmination of that was October 7th.
Okay.
And that's not to remove responsibility from Hamas.
Respond?
Yeah,
But you cannot
Emily,
remove responsibility from Israel
I'll
either.
let Emily respond to that.
I want to ask David, you just said Israel is occupied. Obviously, you hear that narrative every day. And I often...
Is that a narrative, or is it just an objective fact? Is Israel not occupying the West Bank? Are they not occupying Gaza? Did they not do a 17-year-long complete siege on the Gaza Strip? That's how is that a narrative? I mean, to even call that into question in and of itself is completely insane.
Hear chants specifically here in Manhattan. We don't want 2 states. We want all of 48. When the UN came up with the partition plan and nobody was happy with that, and they gave land not only to Israel but Jordan too, I can't help but to think, why does nobody criticize the occupation of Jordanians taking the land from the Palestinians? How come it's only anger once it's the only Jewish state in the entire world, in the entire globe, that suddenly it's occupation? And also, can somebody enlighten me how we occupied the land that never had a prime minister, never had a government, never had a currency, never had one person with historical ties to the land called Palestine?
Sure.
I just can't wrap my head around this occupation narrative.
Well,
that doesn't exist.
let me see if I can help. So the reason why people aren't currently occupied or currently outraged about Egypt occupying Gaza or Jordan occupying the West Bank or something like that is because it's been over since 1967. So, if you want to go back historically, there were bad things that were done by lots of groups of people. However, since then, it's been the Israelis doing the occupation. That's not a narrative. That's just a description of reality. And as far as your point about that there was never a currency or there was never an official state of Palestine, as I've said before, I just find this to be the most un-American, un-enlightenment way of looking at things. I mean, all you have to do is read the...
It's just comparing facts.
It's not. No, it is completely irrelevant. And here's why it's irrelevant. Read the Declaration of Independence. That's all you need to do, and it will completely dispel you of that. The Declaration of Independence starts off right away.
Well, the Middle East is not America.
Hold on, let me just say this. Let me just...
Frankly.
No, okay, fine, it's not, but these values transcend America. It's the idea of natural rights. Man is born free because these are God-given rights, and governments are just something we institute to protect our rights. And if the government isn't doing a good job of that, then the people have the right and maybe even the duty to overthrow that government. No offense, Pierce, you guys, you've had your wins too, but this one was ours. And so I'm just saying, no, listen, it doesn't matter whether they were dominated by the Ottomans or the British Empire or Jordan or Egypt before then. These are human beings who deserve natural rights, and they have absolutely no rights under Israeli rule and haven't since 1967 due to the Israelis.
Okay.
What happened before that is
Palestinians
irrelevant.
actually have full rights in Israel, but okay.
Okay. So towards the end of that, you could see Dave's libertarian side really coming out, calling to overthrow, corrupt, tyrannical governments, etc. But let's just circle back real quick to an absolutely bizarre point that was made by this pro-Israel commentator here on the occupation of Palestinians. Her argument there was, number one, that they couldn't have occupied, it was basically, they couldn't have possibly occupied Palestinian land because Palestinians didn't have a prime minister? Is that the argument that we're going with right now? Now, Dave brought up a comparison to the United States with the Declaration of Independence and, fundamental rights that we as all human beings should have, and that's all fine and good. But the comparison I would make in regards to the United States is basically what she just said there by saying we can't occupy these people, we can't genocide or ethnically cleanse these people by definition because they didn't have a prime minister or they didn't have an officially globally recognized state. Let's apply that to the foundations of the United States of America, because we had settlers who came over to the United States and colonized this land and did a genocide of the Native Americans here. So would you turn around and justify the genocide of the Native American people here in the United States because they didn't have an official prime minister? Is that the fucking argument that we're going here? The only way you can be recognized as human beings, right, who have any rights to sovereignty is if you've already previously had an established prime minister or a currency? That's the argument that we're going with here. And by the way, the point that she's trying to make there, that Palestinians never had any sort of like national ambitions until more recently, is also just fundamentally untrue. I encourage you guys to go and read by Rashid Khalidi, this book called The 100 Years' War on Palestine. And he breaks down very well the early stages of the Palestinian nationalist movement. And that started well before Israel was ever recognized as a state. It effectively started almost immediately after World War I ended, and you had the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And then you had the Balfour Declaration in 1917, where you had one of the most powerful empires on the face of the planet, later to sort of like transition to the United States being in this position after World War II. But you had the most powerful governments in the world backing the Zionist project. What they effectively said, while simultaneously crushing Palestinian political movements to be recognized, to be given a sovereign state at the time, what they did is they propped up a movement that was called Zionism, and is still called Zionism now, effectively recognizing the right of a tiny minority of Jewish Zionists who began colonizing and settling on this land to have a state there, and denying the right of the vast majority of the non-Jewish, non-Zionist Palestinians who lived there to do the same. That's what they did. I mean, when the Balfour Declaration was issued, where Britain officially recognized the Zionist project as being legitimate, what was the Zionist population in Palestine at that time? It was like less than 10% of the population. And even in 1948, when you had this partition plan that was put forward, you still had the state of Israel being given as a part of that plan vastly, disproportionately a larger amount of land than their population would dictate. So this entire argument about, Palestinians never existed, right? They never had any national ambitions until very recently, right? All of this is bullshit. It's ahistorical. And it's all in service of trying to erase the existence of Palestinians from existence. I mean, that's what it is. That's the counter to what her last argument there, that I would bring up. Now, it's also just completely absurd at face value that Israel is not currently occupying the Palestinian people. Of course they're fucking occupying the Palestinian people. This is something that is not controversial to anybody who isn't a disingenuous, lying hack. Okay? This is something that's recognized by even the United States, that recognizes the illegal nature of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank that are continuing to expand, by the way. This is not controversial. And it's also, I mean, it's sort of like fascinating and depressing at the same time in a way, because this is like, what we're seeing is basically a similar kind of settler colonialism to what we saw over the last couple of centuries that were done by Western Europe and, obviously what became the United States. We're seeing that same kind of settler colonialism, but it's happening in real time in modern day, where we have like HD cell phone footage of it, seeing exactly how this process played out, right? I showed you guys a video recently on this channel where it happened all within the course of minutes, where you had a, Zionist Jewish settler who went to a Palestinian and basically said, I'm going to take over your house, right? This is now my land. He was threatening him with like a pipe that he had. The Palestinian can't do anything because he knows if he tries to push back in any way, then he'll be killed. But so basically the settler goes up to this Palestinian, is harassing him, and then he calls in the IDF for backup. And so the IDF goes in and they provide security for this Jewish settler and basically tell the Palestinian, you have 5 minutes to leave this land. We have now officially established this as a military security, a center in this location. You have 5 minutes to get off the land. I mean, we see this happening on video Like, you can go and look up, remember that one that went viral a few years back at this point, where you had that guy from Brooklyn with a heavy Brooklyn accent, and he was kicking a Palestinian out of her home, and she's standing there and she's saying, "You're stealing my home. Why are you doing this?" And he literally was looking at the camera, again, in a full Brooklyn accent, and was like, "Well, you know what? If I don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. You know, don't get mad at me, right? It's not my fault. Don't blame me. Somebody else would do it if it wasn't me." Guys, we have this all on camera. This is the most obvious settler colonial project in history. Of course it is. So to deny that, but not even just to deny the history of it, but to deny the current occupation of Palestinians, is not only ahistorical, but it's also an indication that you have no interest in long-term peace, right? That's something that Piers Morgan brought up as a part of this conversation. How do we get to long-term peace? Here's my answer. Step number one, you have to stop illegally occupying the Palestinian people, right? Palestinians have to be given actual sovereignty and control over their land. That's step number one. A group like Hamas would not exist in the first place, let alone have been able to carry out an attack like October 7th, if it wasn't for the Israeli occupation. And that's something that Dave brought up that almost nobody ever brings up, which is that just a few weeks before October 7th, in late December, and you can go look up pictures of this, Benjamin Netanyahu went to the United Nations and held up a physical map of Greater Israel that included the West Bank and Gaza. If that doesn't reveal their true intentions, then I don't know what will. I don't know what will. So this is not a war of self-defense. This is not a moral quandary, as Piers Morgan is portraying it here. This is a vastly disproportionate in terms of power, that these two sides are able to wield, effectively a settler colonial project that is backed up by the most powerful government on the face of the planet, the United States, that's giving them billions of dollars in weapons and diplomatic support and all of that. And they are carrying out an ethnic cleansing and a genocide on the people who they are colonizing. That's what this is. So this is not some complex issue that we can't figure it out. No, both sides need to, stop being so contentious about this. No, this should be contentious, right? This should be something that people are furious about. This should not be something that we just sit back and have a casual conversation about. We're talking about genocide. We're talking about ethnic cleansing. We're talking about settler colonialism in 2024. This should not be fucking complicated.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying